War Tycoon's tanks as a vehicle category are honestly extremely great. I do really love the design of a lot of tanks and just the overall features which they possess. However, today I'd like to take a step back and actually take a look on some things which the tanks could actually improve. This is basically going to be a part 2 of my previous video where I went over things that could be changed in certain vehicle categories, and today I'm going to be going over the tanks, and all the ideas which were provided to me in this video came from my Discord server, so thank you all so much. So anyway, I'm going to be starting off this video pretty slow, and I'm going to start to have a lot more detailed suggestions as we go more deep into the video. So firstly, I'd like to go over the M3 Bradley and some overall vehicles which are able to transport infantry in real life. However, the M3 Bradley can simply not do that. What I'd like to see in this game is detailed tank interiors. It is something that people have been requesting for a very long time, and I believe vehicles like the M3 Bradley, perhaps maybe even the ADATs, I think those will be the main ones that need to be covered. I'd love to see some tanks actually having potential interiors, because right now the way they are is if you jump right in, there's literally nothing interesting going on. So I feel like it will make the vehicles like the Bradley class just infinitely more enjoyable, since they would actually have an extra purpose on top of what they already have. Now next up, I'm gonna be moving into gun stabilizers, and I think a lot of you guys already know what I'm talking about here. Unfortunately, right now, whenever we're inside the scope, the stabilizers are terrible, and it honestly is extremely hard to aim. Let me actually find a hill which I could climb to showcase to you guys this perfectly. So right here, as I go down the terrain, my aiming just completely gets destroyed as I even move around at all. It is very hard to actually keep track of what's going on if you fully want to play in the zoom. Of course, you shouldn't always be playing in the zoom, but the point I'm trying to make is that the cannons are not stabilized at all, and compared to how they used to be in the previous scope system, this is not even close. Now next up, we're gonna be moving into something a little more interesting, which is going to be the tank brakes. And there do seem to be a few tanks in this game which do have a pretty major issue. Since they're extremely fast, it is super hard to stop. I know it makes sense, and that's why in real life most vehicles use brakes. Actually, if not all of them use brakes. I don't even know what I'm saying here. But like, the BMD takes an extremely long time to slow down, and what I wish we had in this game is potential brakes, because there are times where even some other faster tanks just end up getting stuck in a rock because they could not slow down in time, or they just end up falling in the water or even under the map by some stupid bugs. Now next up, we also have something called roles for different types of users in the tank itself. So for example, we have the driver, we have the commander, and we obviously have the gunner. As you guys can already see, the M1 Abrams only really has a gunner, which has one gun that barely can even aim anywhere, since it's kind of just stuck to one place. What I essentially mean by this feature is that different users of the tank would be able to perform different roles. And since you are right now only a driver as a solo player, you would only be able to perform certain limited things in the tank. So for example, whatever I can do in the M1 Abrams right now would stay. However, if I was to actually have a teammate with me, then the tank would unlock some extra features. It wouldn't be too overpowered, but it would be something that's like a bonus that rewards team playing. Keep in mind that you do have to play really well as a team, because there would be disadvantages to you not being able to cooperate together really well. So with this feature, we would not be removing the features that the tanks already have, but we would be adding special features which they can unlock if there's a teammate with them. Now next up, I'd like to go into detail on a complete rework to the smoke system in the game right now, because as you guys know, the way in which it works is that you basically stand still, you press Q, and then there's smoke surrounding you. And to be totally honest, you're not really stealthy in the smoke. It is so easy to actually see through it from many different directions. So in reality, using it kinda just makes you target practice, and the only reason you would be using the smoke is perhaps just being able to counter missiles. I think that's the only use which it has right now. However, what I wish they've done for the smoke itself is gave it a full-on rework that you would be able to fire something like smoke grenades, just like they do in real life, where the smoke will be fired ahead. So for example, whenever the T-14 fires smoke, it will be fired right here. With this, I would like to also request some kind of buff to the smoke itself, that the smoke will be as big as the one right here. Whenever you actually use it, the opponent basically gets blinded. So if you smoke in someone's face, there would actually be an advantage to this. And the last suggestion which I have with this is also turning smoke into charges, and the reason why this will be balanced is because you have to get inside the smoke if you're firing it forward to be able to counter missiles. You cannot just press Q and immediately counter all the missiles like before. You actually need to do some thinking and have much better reaction time. So for example, different tanks would probably be having different amounts of charges on the smoke. I think something like this would work out really well, and that's probably one of the best suggestions I heard in a really long time. Now next up, we're going to be moving into the thermal imaging system, and right here I'm actually going to be fully reading out the message. Thermal imaging on modern tanks. These essentially act as a ground radar. It will highlight any vehicle or infantry within your line of sight. Some tanks can keep it active for only a short period of time, and others can keep it active for longer periods. And yeah, I completely agree with this suggestion. I do believe that the tank should actually have a proper thermal imaging system, and for the smoke to be able to actually block them would give the smoke even more use, and you have to play with it even more strategically, because instead of just blinding your opponent or defending missiles, you would actually be able to defend yourself from some people's imaging system. However, one more thing which I'd like to add to this is that this would work as an ability. This wouldn't be on the full time, because if it was, then it will basically take away from the use of the Abrams X, which can literally lock on its javelin through walls, which allows it to see where the opponents are. Some other tanks would only know where the enemy is for maybe like 10 seconds, and then there's like a 40-second cooldown. However, either way, this would give the tanks a lot more spice. Now the next idea here is more going to be like a vehicle suggestion, however I do actually really like it. This will be a mid-game addition, which would essentially be the BMP2M, and I really do like the idea of this vehicle because it's basically like a mid-game BMPT Terminator. It is a weaker version of it. It would still have the 4 guided missiles, it would have grenade launchers, and it would not have 2 cannons, it would only be having 1. And I believe something like this would be really balanced because it would allow for maybe a perhaps more agile BMPT, however it would be having less health and its stats would overall be weaker. Like for example, the grenade launchers would be just average damage, however the guided missiles will be way weaker than the BMPTs and the cannon wouldn't be that great. So you'd basically have to play strategically with the unique type of weaponry which this vehicle could offer. And the best part about it is that this wouldn't be a limited, this would be a completely free-to-play vehicle, which would be like a tier 2 operation perhaps. So people wouldn't actually have to grind for the BMPT Terminator to unlock such a monster, but they could get something slightly less powerful but still extremely cool. Now the next idea here would be a variant of the M1 Abrams, which almost fully focuses on anti-air. However, the most unique part about it is that this would be an anti-air vehicle with very heavy armor, and I believe something like this would be really cool, since I don't believe we actually have something like that in the game as of now. I'm not going to be counting shifts as that, but I think a slower M1 Abrams with anti-air capabilities would be extremely cool. Now with this, another suggestion which he gave right here is directional damage, and this is by far something that we really need in Mortagun. I used to think that the directional damage in this game actually existed, because depending on which parts of the tank we actually shot, we were doing different damages, but that was all because of luck and the way in which the explosive damage in this game is calculated for the proximity to the driver. However, either way, I do think it will be cool where different parts would be allowing you to take less damage, while other parts would be forcing you to take more damage, which would effectively force people to play tanks from like a certain side. So for example, you would want to face your enemy from the front to not be taking as much damage. However, if you're turning your back on the opponent, they could just shoot this part right here, and you would basically be taking a lot more damage. So you have to play a lot more strategically than ever before. And now the last suggestion of the day would essentially be different shell types, and I really do love the idea of this, since we technically do have this in the game right now. We got the basic tank cannon which the Moderna has, however it does also have an ATGM. However, with this we would also have a lot of other different tank shells, such as the high velocity shell, which you could basically unlock through scoring kills, which allows the tank cannon to go a lot faster, which basically allows you to be able to shoot enemies out of the sky a lot more efficiently. However, you'll be unlocking this after every few kills, so it's not something that will be super overpowered. Now with this, you would also have something called a high explosive shell, kind of similar to the E100, however it wouldn't be doing a lot of damage, but instead it will be focusing on base raiding and being able to kill infantry. And now lastly, we also have the HESH shell, which personally I don't really agree with it being added to the game. This shell is basically designed for killing the driver in a way, but I think killing the driver in War Tycoon would just feel extremely dry and Personally, I would not be up for that. However, all these other shells I completely agree with. And the one balancing factor of these shells would also be the fact that only the Teen 72 Moderna and the BMD would be able to use two shells at the same time to keep them as unique and balanced vehicles in their own way. However, other tanks would have to alternate between the two shells. Anyway guys, for the time being, that's basically all I have for you guys today. If the developers add all of these, I will be so extremely happy because it will make the tank system so much more fun than what it is right now. It's already a really good system, it just does need some extra changes. And do let me know in the comment section down below whatever vehicle class we should cover next.